Welcome to the short executive knowledge lecture on Topic 1, Paper 3 of the SFC licensing exams. This topic covers the regulatory framework of the Hong Kong financial industry and serves as a backdrop to the topics that will follow. I will emphasize the important points to help you understand the core material you need to know to sit the exam. Now, a copy of the study notes that you see on the screen can be downloaded from the Executive Knowledge website under Resources for Paper 3. I strongly recommend that you supplement this learning with question practice. Preparing for the SFC licensing exams really benefits from doing many practice questions, as it's one of the most effective ways of filling your short-term memory. And we've provided hundreds of practice questions on the Examinator.online platform. And you can see a reference to that at the bottom of each page. You can't actually click to get through, but it is a reliable reference for you. Okay, what are we going to look at in topic 1? You can see by way of the overview, we'll consider the definition of derivatives. Then we'll look at the legislation and regulation. Specifically, we'll consider the Securities and Futures Commission, the main regulator for this paper. We'll also look at the Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing Limited, which owns the Futures Exchange. And then we'll consider briefly other regulators. Now, right up front, I would say you're looking to be answering 3, maybe 4 questions on topic 1. So it's not heavily examined, but questions can come up. Now remember, you've got to get 28 correct to pass. So if you've only got 27 correct, then a question from topic 1 could be vital. Definition of derivatives. What do derivatives include? There you have a list: contracts for difference, convertible bonds, and through it goes. Now, the ones that I would highlight, because I've seen them in questions, are contracts for differences, depository receipts, and futures contracts. Those are all derivatives, as well as the others. What is not a derivative? Something along the line of shares in a collective investment scheme. So if they ask you which one of the following is not a derivative, you should be thinking along those lines. Now, dealing with derivatives, you may have to hold a number of licenses, and we've listed them there: licenses 1, 2, 4, 5, and 9. But the licenses really that we will be considering in paper 3 are 2, dealing in futures contracts, 5, advising on futures contracts, and also 7, providing automated trading services, which is not there, but does come under this paper. Okay, we also have the definition of futures contracts. Contracts for differences. Forward contracts, I don't think so. It says only when they are traded on an exchange, but generally no. Forward contracts are not considered futures contracts, but also options on futures. So there's a question for you: which one of the following is not considered a futures contract? And they would give you contracts for differences, futures contracts, and options on futures contracts. Those 3 are considered futures contracts, and then they'll throw something else in which is not. We've got some material on options. We've got stock options and warrants, and they're traded on the stock exchange. But options on futures contracts are traded on the futures exchange, and that's something that you have to be clear on. Moving along, we're looking at legislation and regulation. Well, the main piece of legislation for us is the Securities and Futures Ordinance. But we also have rules. These are the SFC rules. For example, the client security rules, the client money rules that you will come to later. Rules are also legislation and can be enforced. So please remember, ordinances are primary legislation, rules are subsidiary legislation, and both have the force of law. Whereas codes of conduct and guidelines issued by the SFC do not have the force of law, but you still have to follow them if you are complying with the requirements of your license. And we also have guidance notes. Again, guidance notes are not legislation. Now, looking at the Securities and Futures Ordinance itself, we've listed all the different parts, and the reference is to the paragraph in topic 1 that where we cover each of those. So I'm going to just go straight to covering the separate parts. So part 3 there, under paragraph 2.2.1, recognizes exchange companies, clearinghouses, exchange controllers, etc., in Hong Kong. And we've listed there what each category means. Be aware, I wouldn't say it's central, but be aware of it. Now, over-the-counter OTC derivative transactions, these are not futures. These are, just as they say, over-the-counter, one-to-one, two counterparties trading with each other. These were relatively unregulated up until after 2008, when we had all the problems with OTC derivatives and the identification of them. And so Hong Kong has followed and is included a part in the Securities and Futures Ordinance on OTC derivatives. Now, we'll also address OTC derivative regulations in topic 7. 2.2.2 on default rules for exchange companies. Be aware, but I wouldn't say it was central. Now, part 5 of the ordinance, paragraph 223, on licensing and registration. An intermediary, first of all, must be incorporated, but must also be licensed to carry out a regulated activity or be registered. Now, you'd be registered if you're an approved financial institution, authorized financial institution. We'll come to that at the end of this topic. But also the representatives. So it's the company must hold the license, but also the employee who is involved in a regulated activity. What are the regulated activities? There they are, top of page 1.6. Regulated activity 1 through 10. Now, as I said earlier, the ones that we have to be aware of for paper 3 are dealing in futures contracts, number 2, advising in futures contracts, number 5, and there's number 7, providing automated trading services. Part 6 of the ordinance looks at capital requirements, client assets, records, and audit. And those are covered by specific legislation, the rules. There they are: financial resource rules, client security rules, client money rules, keeping of accounts and records. That's keeping of record rules. Now, those rules are vital for the exam, and they are covered later in the material. This is by way of an introduction. Part 7 of the ordinance covers business conduct of intermediaries. But rather than legislate for business conduct, what the SFC has done, has issued, well, it already had issued, code of conduct. So if you are licensed, you must follow the code of conduct, which, as I said earlier, does not have the force of law, but you must comply to continue holding your license. And we also have the management, supervision, and internal control guidelines, some of which we will have to be aware of when we are covering later material. Right at the bottom there, it says naked or uncovered short selling is prohibited. So in Hong Kong, naked short selling, where you do not have access to the underlying asset, is illegal. Covered short selling is permitted. And then we have some rules with regard to short selling that are outlined there. More details on unsolicited calls, cold calling, that will be covered to topic 4. Part 7 of the ordinance also covers investor compensation. An outside chance this could come up. We have the Investor Compensation Fund, which was set up in 2003, which retail investors can claim against if they suffer from the default of an intermediary. And as it says there, the compensation limit is 500,000 Hong Kong dollars per claim per person. We then have a part on offences and disclosure of interest. The offences dealt with in topic 4. And then we have some miscellaneous provisions under part 16. I'm not going to dwell too much on those. Let's go to the Securities and Futures Commission on page 1.8. Now, the SFC, the major regulator that we've got to be aware of, was created by law. It's independent of government, but it does report to government. Now, what are the objectives of the SFC? They're listed there, and I would say there's an outside chance you could have a question. So I'll run through them very quickly. The objectives are, the reason the SFC exists is to maintain, promote fairness, efficiency, competitiveness, transparency, orderliness of the industry, promote understanding by the public of the financial services, provide protection to the investing public, minimize crime and misconduct, reduce systemic risks in the industry, and assist Financial Secretary in maintaining financial stability of Hong Kong. So that's why the SFC exists. That's the big picture. What does the SFC actually do to meet those objectives? Well, that's covered under functions and power. And we've listed the principal functions of the SFC under paragraph 3.3, and a lot of these functions we deal with in later topics. We also have the operational units of the SFC. There are 5: the Corporate Finance Division, the Enforcement Division, the Investment Products Division, Supervision of Markets, and Intermediaries. And we've given details of each of those on pages 1.9 and 1.10. Again, not core material at paper 3. Now, Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing Limited. It's worthwhile getting a grasp of the organization of this entity. At the top, we have the recognized exchange controller. That's the listed company, Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing Limited. And that company owns the companies underneath it. On the left-hand side, we've got the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong, and underneath that we have 2 clearing houses, the Hong Kong Securities Clearing Company and the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong Options and Clearing House. Now, going down the left-hand leg is securities, dealing in securities and the clearing and settlement of securities, including traded options. Down the right-hand side is the world of futures, and that's what paper 3 is about. So futures are traded on the futures exchange and are settled by the Hong Kong Futures Exchange Clearing Corporation using the appropriate clearing and settlement system. Please be aware that options on futures go down the right-hand leg, whereas options on securities go down the left-hand leg in that they're traded on the stock exchange. Options on futures are traded on the futures exchange. And we've got some notes towards the bottom there on 2 divisions of Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing, the Market Division and the Post-Trade Division. Now, other regulators, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, that's fairly important. It may not be directly examined at paper 3, but you should be aware that authorized financial institutions, and I'm on the left-hand side of the diagram, authorized financial institutions, which are principally banks, are directly supervised by the HKMA. Those that perform an SFC regulated activity, and for us that's activity 2, 5 and 7, they must register with the SFC and they will be known as registered institutions. For everyone else that's performing SFC regulated activities, that's those that are not AFIs, not banks, they must be licensed by the SFC and are known as licensed corporations. Now, a combination of registered institutions and licensed corporations are collectively known as intermediaries, and that terminology can be used in the exam. So please be aware, registered institution will be an AFI supervised by HKMA, but registered with the SFC to carry out a regulated activity. Whereas licensed corporations are supervised by the SFC and they are licensed to carry out regulated activities, both known as intermediaries. And a few more bits and pieces, notes at the top, page 1.13 on the HKMA and AFIs, etc., and also recognizing another regulator, the International Organization of Securities Commission, IOSCO. So that's a quick run through topic one. It's the regulatory framework. I would say it's introductory material. I wouldn't ignore it, but there are not going to be as many questions on this topic as later topics. And as ever, I would recommend that you go to Examinator.online for your question practice for topic one, paper 3.